As part of our course on the Economics of Socialism, we look at the theory of collective ownership. That is, what do we expect to happen when resources are collectively owned? Mansur Olson's classic book, The Logic of Collective Action, offers us one theory, which is probably the best known in both economics and political science. Olson asserts that people do not voluntarily and unilaterally contribute to collective goods, even though they appreciate the way the goods are used, because they rely on others to make the contribution. In other words, collective ownership is going to suffer from a free riding problem. The resource will be undersupplied and overutilized. That's the prediction for collective ownership of, say, food production, collective ownership of healthcare production, or collective ownership of health insurance, to name a few. This is the same message in Milton Friedman's video about spending other people's money on other people. Margaret Thatcher famously captured the first part. Let's watch.
And socialist governments traditionally do make a financial mess. They always run out of other people's money.
In this video, we are going to look at what some other intellectuals have to say about the results of collective ownership, especially those who disagree with Olson, even if they do not directly articulate and confront his logic. In the following lecture, we will look again at the testimony of eyewitnesses, that is, people who have lived in a country with collective ownership or lived with collective ownership on a smaller scale, such as in a commune or kibbutz. And we'll also look at systematic measures of the results of collective ownership. Let's start with the issue of single-payer healthcare, which refers to a system in which only the government is allowed to provide health insurance. This issue is often framed as a comparison between countries that already have single-payer, such as some of the countries in Western Europe, and the United States that does not. In both types of countries, it's the workers that finance the health care. In the single-payer approach, the financing comes from a payroll tax taken out of each worker's paycheck. In the United States, workers have private insurance premiums taken out of their paycheck. The bottom line, so the argument goes, is merely the amount taken out, and therefore how much the worker has left to spend on other things. Let's look at a couple of seconds from one of my favorite YouTube shows, The Young Turks. In this episode, they are celebrating the initiation of a single-payer healthcare bill in California. Let's see what they say about taxes versus private insurance premiums.
So when I saw a 15% payroll tax increase, I was like, well, that is a lot. That is quite a bit, right? And then, of course, you realize, oh no, but then you don't have to pay for healthcare, at all. So your premiums are gone, and any kind of contribution gone, all that gone, which a lot of businesses have to pay.
I am not singling out the Young Turks. This argument is very common. Here is a pay stub that illustrates what they are saying. On the left, we have Mr. James Roberts' gross pay, and on the right side of the pay stub, we have the deductions from his pay. The deductions include a big item, Blue Cross Blue Shield Family Health Insurance Premium, $550 so far this year. By the Young Turks' way of thinking, it would hardly be any different if we just changed the description in that line to National Health Insurance Tax. It's still $550. Just a little ink has changed and nothing of real substance. Mansur Olson says this is dead wrong, and that there is a massive difference between the two approaches. The Roberts family gets the same benefits from national health insurance taxes regardless of how much James pays, or even if he pays anything at all, as he would not pay anything during periods when he's not working. Going back to the private health insurance premium, we have a big difference here. Now the Roberts family gets the benefits from private health insurance only if they pay the $550. They are free to take a vacation from paying the $550, but then get no health insurance during that vacation. So that's the first argument. Related to it is the idea that public ownership is simpler and less costly. That's kind of the theme of the single-payer label. Wouldn't things be easier if there were just one health insurance organization instead of so many? Let's go back to the Young Turks.
You're going to eliminate a lot of overhead that we pay to the middleman. So at the end of the day, as a California resident, I would actually save money. I would, and perhaps a lot of money. So and when you do that equation, you go, okay, I get it. I'm paying more in taxes, but I'm not. I get to keep all this other money. So if at the end of the day I've saved, well, whatever the number is, $100, who cares that I'm paying more taxes? Yeah. I have got more money in the bank. And by the way, potentially much better health insurance.
A common argument in academics is that the government has lower administrative costs and that it makes it cheaper for everybody. But remember that the private companies are not doing administration for their amusement. They are trying to make sure that the payments are proper and trying to prevent fraud. If they fail to do those things, their costs will be high, their customers will have to pay more, and the company will lose customers. The government administrators have no incentive to worry about this because their customers are guaranteed and are forced to pay the taxes. So perhaps there is less administrative cost in a government business, but there is also a lot more fraud. The second argument is about economies of scale. The government program will be cheaper, supposedly, merely because it is bigger. This is the critical argument behind why private competition is not allowed. It's not enough, they say, to have a government program alongside private companies and let the customer choose, because then the government program would not be as large as it could be and therefore not generate all of the savings that it could. Historically, both politicians and professors pushed the economies of scale theory. They were talking about agriculture then, but making the same arguments that are made today about healthcare. You had Vladimir Lenin, who was leading Russia after its revolution, promising to put all the farms in the hands of the government and how that would make farming better. After all, unlike private agriculture that has thousands, if not millions, of individual farmers making their own individual decisions, the government-run farm could have the very best and brightest make the decisions, and the rest of us just obey. Paul Samuelson, who was MIT's best and brightest economist and the first American to ever win a Nobel Prize in economics, was enamored with the Soviet Union for this reason. He was genuinely puzzled when the data kept coming in showing that when small, privately owned farms popped up in the Soviet Union, they proved to be more productive than the government farms. Samuelson kept blaming it on the weather. It was just a coincidence that the Soviet people were starving while Americans were not. Of course, Ansar Olson and Milton Friedman knew what the problem was with collective farms, but Samuelson was still puzzled. The data trickling out of the Soviet Union did not dampen Western academics' enthusiasm for collective farming. Joan Robinson, who likely would have won a Nobel Prize herself if she had lived a few more years, was really excited when China collectivized its farms. Finally, she said, the government would be operating farming on the proper scale. A year after she wrote that, the starvation of the Chinese people began. There's a saying, the quickest path to starvation is making food free. A serious person has to at least address the question of why making healthcare free would not drastically reduce the amount of healthcare, in the way that making food free drastically reduced the amount of food. This is not to deny any economies of scale. Not everyone is created equal in terms of managerial talent. But the talent of the most talented is not so overwhelming that they need to run everything. Size itself has costs that are too easily ignored. The third argument is that the government gets a bulk discount. It is related to the economies of scale argument, but we will treat it specifically at the end of the course when we look at monopoly and monopsony. By the way, these arguments about the simplicity of single payer and how it leverages economies of scale are not particular to agriculture or health. They work the same just for about any industry, whether it be education or airlines or housing. So you need to think about why you want to socialize, say, health insurance, but do not want to socialize other industries. Or maybe you do want the government running everything. One argument against Olson is that he puts too much emphasis on incentives. People will work and produce a lot even if you tax them a lot. So the argument goes. Just look at the Nordic countries. Yeah, the extreme socialist countries such as the Soviet Union, Cuba, and Mao's China had disincentives. But the Nordic countries did too. So it must be something other than disincentives that produced bad results in the extreme socialist countries. Maybe it's just as simple that Lenin and Mao and Castro were just bad guys. That's the argument. We will come back to the Nordic countries later. For now, let's accept, for the sake of discussion, that Nordic taxes are somewhat higher than normal and that their work and production has not noticeably suffered. This is not enough to conclude that the extreme socialist countries would have failed even without disincentives. That's the fallacy of the heap. That fallacy refers to the idea that you can take a grain of sand and set it on a table, and that one grain of sand is not a heap of sand. You can put a second grain of sand next to it. You still don't have a heap of sand. The third grain of sand doesn't make it a heap. And therefore, every time you add a grain of sand, never makes it a heap. And therefore, you can put as many grains of sand down as you want, and you'll never have a heap of sand. You can see the fallacy. Just as you pile grain upon grain, you get eventually a heap of sand. As you pile disincentives on top of disincentives, you eventually get the economic disasters known as the Soviet Union, Cuba, etc.